At the beginning of December 2020, I decided that I'd spent far too much of my life complaining about game design trends, and not nearly enough actually designing. After so many train wreck AAA releases last year, I asked myself the fated question, how hard could it really be? Obviously, the answer to that question is very. Given all I've read of the industry, it's honestly a miracle that video games even get made at all, let alone be profitable. Big companies seem to burn through their employees like firewood on a cold winter's night. And I've been subject to those flames of crunch in a different industry, so my sympathies go to those developers. And yet, the vast majority of players don't even play the games that they complain about having to spend $60 on for more than a few hours before their attention is stolen away by the next hot topic. So I'm under no illusion that this will be easy. But there's some hope in my heart, because I'm also genuinely excited to eventually play the games that I want to make. I've done my fair share of GMing over the years. I've made plenty of hacks for tabletop games, and little personal, mostly cosmetic mods for computer games, but barely shared any of them with anyone save my friends. But I'm not gonna shy away from the crowds this time. I'm going to make the sort of games that will fulfill my very specific tastes and interests, and hope that other people find this niche that I carve out interesting too. Or at least have fun watching me fail along the way. Speaking of failure, how likely am I to do that? Well, I have zero real game dev experience, and as the title says, I only just started learning Unity this month. I'd not properly touched a 3D modeling program like Blender in almost 5 years. I've never worked with C# or HLSL, or done much programming in general for that matter, except for using MATLAB and R when I was at university. I don't know the first thing about music theory or sound design, and last year I failed to finish my master's degree because I was too depressed. Still, I'm really passionate and I'm just brimming with complicated and difficult to implement ideas, so I think I'll be a great addition to the team. Comedically underselling myself aside, I do think that this will be difficult, but in a strange way it's that same difficulty that I find appealing. The multimedia nature of video games may well make them the highest expression of artistry that we'll ever know, unless or until some whole new forms of entertainment get invented. And so I'm intrigued to at least experiment with the medium and find out what I'm capable of. With that half preamble, half self-motivating speech out of the way, it's time to tell you how I began my journey and how it's going so far. Well, as you might expect, it actually began with building up that motivation and inspiration in the first place. I listened to a lot of GDC talks and video essays on YouTube about how games are made and the thought processes that go into some of their features. In particular, because I'm a lazy artist who's always looking for tools to speed up his workflow, I found myself drawn to talks on procedural content. That means anything that uses algorithms or a set of rules to generate assets that can then be used in a game. Animations, dialogue, terrain, textures, sounds, even narratives. It's a very broad topic, and depending on how you define it, almost anything can be made procedurally. But the main takeaway from me was that a tool probably exists that will help me make the stuff I want to make, and if it doesn't, I can probably make one myself once I get good at coding. Also, I watched a few technical demos, took notes about some legal stuff involving intellectual property, and watched the very spectacular Failing to Fail by Jeff Vogel, which is like the indie game development equivalent of that 10-year-old Why You Will Fail to Have a Great Career TED Talk that I'm sure everyone has seen. Seriously, go watch both of these videos if you haven't. Then Bennett Foddy and Zach Gage taught me that I should put my name on my stuff rather than hiding behind a silly studio name. So, without further ado, hi there, I'm William Barton, also known as Seraaron. I live in rural North Wales. I'm a 26-year-old queer artist, writer, mathematician, and local father of a adopted pheasant called Trevor, and now I'm a game developer too, I guess. Lastly, after watching a few success and failure stories from other indie devs relayed on YouTube, I knew that if I was going to do this properly, I'd need to be relatively financially stable. I'd need to sort out my exercise, dietary, and sleeping habits, and I'd need to take steps to properly pace myself and not get burnt out. So I set aside some savings, bought a yoga mat and some kettlebells, and started using Notion to plan my personal curriculum and act as my task manager. Then I took my first proper steps into game dev and downloaded Unity. Why Unity? Simple. It was the first game engine I thought of. That said, plenty of well-known games that I enjoy have been made in it, and the license is fairly generous for hobbyists and indies. I may come to regret this decision later, but I think the skills I learn in Unity will also be fairly transferable. Plus, I spent too much time distro hopping last year when I switched to Linux, so I'd rather just make a decision and stick to it to avoid engine hopping too. I've taught myself a fair number of skills over the years, to the point where I'm confident in saying that if I have a hidden talent, it's being a fast learner. And at this point, I know how I like to learn. I type, "How do you do X?" into Google and start reading and watching as much as I can. If a problem has already been solved, then there's no value in memorizing it, just bookmark it and come back whenever you get stuck. So eventually I found a tutorial that I wanted to try for myself, this one by Imphenzia. There are a ton of baby's first Unity tutorials on YouTube, but most of them are under 15 minutes, use a slew of downloadable assets, and always left me feeling out of my depth by the end. This one by Stefan is slow, methodical, and relatively thorough. In it, you make the basics of a 2.5D platformer completely from scratch. I followed along, and this was my end result. I usually like to experiment and poke at the limits of my experience while I'm learning, so I made my demo fully 3D and added a little squish animation to the capsule, though I couldn't get the camera to follow properly. When I was in uni, I devised a good analogy for the general process of learning new skills. I say that learning is like spelunking, or what I imagine spelunking to be like at least. You crawl through tight mental spaces, there's darkness all around you, and without a safety line you'd be completely screwed if you ever got stuck. You can cast your light around looking for new paths, but there may well be whole other tunnels and chambers right next to you that would be much easier to traverse, but you'd never know unless someone else had been down there before and at least left some pythons. Ultimately, you're never really able to build a full mental map of the space, but sometimes you find a tunnel that leads you back to a place that you recognize, and you retread your steps from there. Or you realize that there's a much easier way to get back. Often, that feeling is relieving, other times it's frustrating. But either way, your time is rarely wasted, and if you're really lucky, or perhaps unfortunate, you'll find a crevice that no one has ever been down before. That's why I think it will be useful for others if I make these devlogs, so that my path can be followed or avoided as per your own requirements. As such, I've left links to all the resources mentioned in the doobly-doo and the blah-blah down below, and if you want to stay updated on how my journey is going, then please consider subscribing. Among other things, I found some really good tutorials that are definitely too advanced for me right now, but I want to note them down for future reference. In particular, Dapper Dino has a series on solid design principles and best practices for building good systems architecture, and Matt Mirrorfish has a scriptable objects cookbook playlist that I think will be really useful to go through in the future, which also includes some procedural stuff. But for now, my tutorial series of choice has been the wonderful Catlike coding by Jasper Flick, which drew my attention immediately because they're structured from a very pragmatic standpoint. starting with something as simple as building a clock and then a mathematical surface graph using instanced cubes, and using it to introduce a whole slew of concepts that will be integral to the long-term success of a project. Those being how to measure and optimize performance, how to use compute shaders, different render pipelines, and burst packages for really complicated jobs. Basically pushing the engine to its absolute limits from the word go to demonstrate to the reader what they have to work with before they try to make their first game. I had a lot of trouble getting my compute shaders to work though, so I looked for other tutorials and found this one by Three-Eyed Gaming about building a Raytracing shader from scratch. But at the time of this recording, the website is down or broken. Still, from what I've read, a lot of the content in it was based on Raytracing in One Weekend by Peter Shirley, so if you're trying to follow along, then go there instead. In the end, I had quite a lot of fun building mathematical graphs, and I once again pushed the boundaries a bit with both tutorials by trying out some more complicated graphs, including getting a Fourier square wave working and a Weierstrass primordial function, which is one of my favorite mathematical functions. And with the ray tracer, after spending an embarrassingly long time debugging for what ended up being a single missing float value and a sign change, I finally got reflections working, and then decided to play around with it a bit and added a modulo to the distance function and made it do this, which is... I don't understand this, but it's cool. My only major tipping point so far has been the jobs tutorial. I got the fractal working and animated and rendering with a compute shader, but the burst packages goes a little over my head, and I encountered a weird error in the shader graph that I just don't know how to fix yet. Wait, there's no game yet? Never has been. So, what's next? For now, I'm gonna stick with Catlike coding. I like his style, and being able to follow along with a text tutorial is easier for me, I think, than YouTube videos. The next tutorial series is on building a simple platformer, starting with just sliding a sphere around, then controlling the camera, adding gravity, climbing and swimming mechanics, and building reactive obstacles. I'm excited to try it all out. But also on my soon-to-do list are his tutorials on mesh deformation and noise generation. Over the New Year's sale, I bought the Easy Save asset from the Unity store, because save systems honestly seem like one of the most complicated things to have to deal with, and I'm not interested in reinventing the wheel. I also picked up some Lux shaders to learn by example from when I dig deeper into shader scripting, and some royalty-free music from Dark Fantasy Studios in a humble bundle, which I can use in games or YouTube videos without fear of a copyright strike. Lastly, I want to talk about 3 tools that I'm very excited about. 2 are paid, about $100 each, but they're both very awesome and probably worth it for the amount of time they'll save me in the long term. The first is QuickShape and QuickCurve for Blender by Jama Jurabev and Alksander. These 2 tools combine to make sculpting in Blender fun for me again. The feeling you get from drawing in 3D is so satisfying, and the speed with which you can build up shapes once you get used to the controls is really cool. QuickShape feels like building up and carving off chunks of clay, and QuickCurve feels like drawing with a 3D printer. It's amazing. The second is Gaea by QuadSpinner, a tool that I literally only discovered the other day and haven't installed yet, but which looks frankly incredible. It's used for making procedural terrain maps, but the feature that really blows my mind is the ability to draw mountains directly onto the canvas, not just with a textured stamp, but content-aware, non-destructive erosion. It's something I've been saying for years now. Why doesn't a feature like this exist in terrain-generating tools? Well, now I can hush my mouth. Hey Gaea, please sponsor me. Lastly, and to end on a free note, there is Tab9, a free AI plugin for most IDEs like Atom and VS Code, which uses deep learning to help you write code faster. It's trained by trawling through open source and Creative Commons programs off of GitHub, and supports an alarming number of languages as a result, with partial support even for things like HLSL, which is based on C. The only downside of Tab 9 is that it takes about 1.5 gigabytes of RAM to run in the background, so it's not great for laptop use, but if you want, you can pay to offload that onto their cloud service. Otherwise, it's completely free and secure. It's actually amazing to me to learn that programmers can finally start to benefit from AI research too, and not just rich people who can afford self-driving cars. I've been using it for like half a month, and its ability to predict what I want to type is almost spooky. I love it. It's great for me as I'm learning C#, but it's probably good for any developer out there, and at the very least, it'll help to reduce my RSI. I'm going to try to do these sorts of devlogs regularly, especially once I stop using as many tutorials and start developing properly for myself. So once again, consider subscribing, like the video, share it if you think it was useful, and thanks for watching.